Excellent. Thank you very much. Thanks to the organizers. I'll try to keep it brief, but I cannot but thank the organizers for what has been a terrific hospitality. It's my first time here, and so far it has been delightful. So today, as it has been anticipated, I want to talk a little bit about the Middle East, in particular, what are the regional threats that are emerging from this region to which I devoted my life in terms of studies. So this is the structure of a presentation, so you know what poison you're going to die of. And I'm going to talk a bit about theory at the beginning, and this is the time when you can check your email and so on and so forth, particularly for a practitioner. This is like what academics are so bound to do. But then we're going to get more into the meaty stuff, and I'm going to talk about what people call a new Middle East Cold War, but I'd rather call a war by proxy, which is the one between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I'm going to try a little bit to disarticulate this idea of sectarianism as a driving force. I mean, sectarianism is the new buzzword. If you go to Washington, D.C., if you National Defense University or like the CIA, this is what is driving the security discourse about the Middle East right now. But I think we have to be careful, and at least we have to be very, very sort of like detailed and specific when you talk about sectarianism, because it really changes its role depending on each national context. So sometimes it's actually a positive thing. At least that's when I grew up studying the Middle East, sectarianism was seen as positive, was seen as one of the successes behind the Lebanese economy and so on and so forth. And anyway, then there are a few things, though, that do not change. So you can, like we always look at the Middle East as something that is changing very fast, but a few things do not change. So you can write this down, and we're going to be there for at least the foreseeable future, for the next 15 years or so. And then I want to sort of disentangle some policy tropes and make some very cautious predictions, which I will always learn not to do, but I'm going to sort of chance it because I think that people are always interested in what we Arabs think of the region. So without any further ado, let me start. This has been touched upon today already by our keynote speaker, by the previous speaker. When we talk about security, it is always a good idea to answer the question, security by who, for whom, and how fungible is power, and in particular military power. This is something that we need to do whenever we talk about any region in the world, but it's particularly true for the Middle East, because as we will see, sort of military power is not that fungible in the region, as many different armies have learned, or better said, many decision makers have learned by sending their armies that were not, then did not prove successful because the battlefield is shifting. So even right now, I mean, if we look at the Middle East, we really have to think about the fact that both traditional military power and political influence are both important. And if you look at the behavior of states like Saudi Arabia, you will see that they don't balance just against military threats. They're very, very scared of external manipulative mobilization and of political influence. So it would be really wrong to just think in terms of sheer military power. And also, with many of these sort of regimes, particularly the Arab monarchies of the Gulf, always keep in mind that the main foreign policy goal is regime security. And this also has implications for the way you organize your armed forces and so on and so forth. Okay, so second theory slide here. This just to say that, we can talk about the Middle East as a semi-autonomous security complex, but I mean, the real point that I want to make here is that there is a security interdependence about the countries of the region, and this interdependence is unfortunately still negative, and it looks like it's going to be negative for some time. But you cannot think of the security policies of one country in isolation to the security policies of neighboring countries. So this is a traditional sort of security subcomplex, and that's we scholars of international relations like to focus on. So that's about it for the theory. So now you can sort of wake up, and this is the more policy relevant part of the presentation that is coming up. So what do we see now is the Iran-Saudi rivalry. and this new Middle East Cold War that is very much influences all the security developments in the region. So this is the main axis that we see. There are reasons why some authors, like my friend and mentor Greg Goss, talk about a Cold War, and the main reason is that this is unlikely to develop into a military conflict. So this is very, very unlikely, but it happens and then it takes place as a war by proxy. So what these two countries are trying to do is to fill the contested vacuums in the weak states of the region by sponsoring sub-state actors or sponsoring certain governments, like the Syrian one, that do not have control of their entire sovereign territories. So this is what is going on right now in the Middle East. There is a resemblance to the Arab Cold War of the 50s and the 60s. That's why people like to use this sort of somewhat catchy title of a Cold War. And as you remember, that was the time when the traditional monarchical regimes were pitted against the Arab socialist republics. But the big difference, of course, now is that one of the two main actors, Iran, is not an Arab country. So that is one of the two protagonists. So where do we see this happening? I mean, in all these countries that I listed here, in Bahrain, where you had like an intervention by the GCC forces after the government was proving unable to control the revolt a few years back, Lebanon, Yemen, where this is actually not a Cold War, but it's a hot war, and this I'm going to talk a bit about because it's very interesting how the Saudis are much more proactive than they used to be in the past. I mean, we used to have here like the commander of land forces, Saudi Arabia, which is now like involved in Yemen alongside the Air Force, Iraq, and crucially Syria. Why do I say Syria crucially? Because I think both parties have decided that Syria is where the ostensible victor is going to emerge. So they're really going all in the case of Syria. All of this, of course, has its origins back in the 1979 revolution, but I don't want to go too long about history and, with the coming of Islamic Republic in Iran. But certainly, there was an acceleration first in 2003 when the regime change in Iraq weakened a number of states and made this sort of like meddling by these two countries easier. And then with the Arab uprisings and the civil wars of 2011, which made it even more salient. Because if you remember, I mean, Bahrain was where the wave of the Arab Spring stopped, because it came too close to home for the Saudis and for their neighbors, and they said, this is going to stop, we're going to intervene militarily. And from then on, you had sort of this reflux in terms of like a regime. So this is how it started, and this is how it's accelerated. What really changed also compared to previous decades is the proactive stance of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia at one point felt that the United States was not guaranteeing its interests anymore. They felt they didn't, the Americans, which are still the closest allies, didn't have their backs. So they tried to intervene directly, and they did. And either through financial means or through sort of directly militarily, as in the case of Yemen. This is a break with previous Saudi foreign policy making traditions. So, and as I said before, Syria and Yemen are the main battlegrounds where a victor will emerge. So when we think about this rivalry, and when you read about it in the newspapers, more often than not, this is portrayed as a sectarian rivalry. to a certain extent, this is true, because both Iran and Saudi Arabia are utilizing sectarianism. But do keep in mind that they both deny that they're doing it. So if you go to the Saudi ambassador or the Iranian ambassador, or any representative, say, like, are you really using sectarianism to say, no, it's the other party that does it. We don't like to think in sectarian terms. But of course, they both do it, through various means. But this is very different from like a sub-state organization, for example, let's say the Islamic State, which instead is very proud of like saying, yes, we are using sectarianism, we should kill those who are even worse than Muslims and so on and so forth. So they're utilizing sectarianism. So from that extent, this is true. But at the same time, they're very happy to cross the sectarian threshold where they see some even tactical gain to be gained from it. So both countries, and here I have the case of Hamas, which is a very, very Sunni, but it's sponsored by Iran at various times in its history, of like the Ikhwan in Egypt, which was also sponsored for some time. They had good relations before they were thrown out of power, and in Lebanon this has happened very many times. So do not take sectarianism as your compass, because it's going to lead you astray. This is not how decision makers think and operate in Saudi Arabia and Iran. These are political conflicts with, or at the moment without, political solutions. There is a research project where, in understanding where does it really stop, within the decision-making hierarchy, when do really people start believing this propaganda? So that's interesting, but it's not for me to say, because I'm a political scientist, so we need an anthropologist and a well-connected anthropologist to find that out. These are the basics. Now I come to the things that are not going to change. So you can sort of write them down, and possibly throughout your career, this is going to be true. So, you see all this change in the Middle East, but these things are not going to change, particularly in the Gulf. One thing is that armies in the Arab states of the Gulf are not organized in a way to maximize their fighting capability. So that's it. And we've seen this repeatedly in Yemen and in other conflict situations. And so most of you are military men, and you may say, why? These countries, they spend so much money on weapons, procurement, and so on and so forth. Why wouldn't you try to make the best of use of it? And the reason is quite simple, is like if you look at what happened to monarchies in the Middle East, they have been overthrown more often than not by armies. And the monarchs of the Gulf came to the conclusion that they have more to sort of like fear from an army in terms of domestic stability that they can gain by having a very efficient and maximized political sort of army that can fight battles. Even because, to tell you the truth, I really doubt that even if everybody did their homework and so on and so forth, they could withstand an Iranian aggression. So, why risk it? And that's why when you look at the armed forces in these countries, you see things that to you as military men and women do not make much sense. So the fact that you have the Ars Wataniya, the National Guard, which is different from the Jaish, from the army, and like that commanders are like placed strategically in certain places. So that's why it happens. And this is not going to change. And I would do the same. So this is not a particularly critical remark. If I were the Emir of Kuwait or the King of Saudi, like I would organize things exactly this way. So, but this is staying. So this also means that another thing that is not going to change is the need for an offshore balancer, and currently in the foreseeable future, this is going to be the United States of America. They may not like it. Many people in the region do not like it. Many people in the Gulf do not like it. But this is a reality they have to deal with. Of course, this leads to a tension that then creates quite a few of the problems that we highlighted before in terms of like sub-state organizations, radicalism, and so on and so forth. This is particularly true in terms of like Saudi Arabia, but at the same time will always lend U.S. leverage over GCC states. So the Gulf monarchies, they will never be able to act autonomously. Even when we think that American policy choices are very, very misguided, as they did repeatedly, like in terms of, like, for example, in 2003 with the regime change in Iraq, but there is nowhere they can go. But they are more proactive. But even Yemen right now, for example, look at where they're engaged militarily. The thing would not last a week if someone in DC decided for it not to last. And even this is not a particularly critical remark, because it's true for us Europeans as well. I mean, we've seen this in Libya, where we sort of like ran out of ammunition and quite quickly, and then the Americans had to come and help us out. So I don't want to say this as it's not a Eurocentric remark. So this is another truth. And this is like, a map of where the Americans are, at least officially. And then there are quite a few sort of like bases that now you see on Google Maps, from which they run drones and so on and so forth, that are not on this map, but it's a long-standing security presence in the Gulf, which is going to remain as an important feature in the Middle East security map. Now, talking about a few things that come and go, particularly if you are in Washington, D.C., as sort of what I call policy tropes. One which people like to talk a lot about is the rise of China in terms of a security in the Gulf and the Middle East more generally. And it's absolutely true that China is now a very important player in the Middle East, both in the commercial and the economic sector. For example, it is the largest trading partner of Saudi Arabia, which would have been unthinkable when I started studying the country. At the same time, I mean, if you go to China, like few people do, and you ask them, what is your plan for the Gulf and the Middle East, they quite candidly, decision makers tell you, we don't have an interest in a physical presence in the Gulf or in the Middle East. Because right now we can do business with both sides of the Gulf. When I go to Tehran, my hotel is full of Chinese businessmen, delegations, which have been helping out even when there were sanctions imposed against Iran. Much of the Iranian oil industry was being run with the help of Chinese consultants. You go to the Saudi Arabia and you see Chinese missiles being bought. All the way since the late 80s, you see that the Chinese have been doing business with the Saudi Arabia and the Arab monarchies, particularly when they get displeased by a particular American decision. I mean, the Saudis go and they buy something from the Chinese. I mean, the Silk War missiles and so on and so forth, when the Americans were a bit hesitant in selling AWACS. And so that is the reason why I don't think that there is going to be an interest for China to have a strategic physical presence in the Gulf or in the Middle East. I don't see why they should. Because also, keep in mind that there are a few political disputes where the Chinese do not have to make a call. And it's a bit like abortion in American politics. You can be a national hero, but as soon as you say what you think about abortion, you lose 40% of the audience, one way or the other. And the same, for example, is true for the Abu Musa and the two Tams Islands in the Gulf, which are disputed between the Emirati and the Iranians. So that's it. Another trope is NATO in the Gulf. I mean, this is almost too old, so I won't dwell on it very much, because the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative has peaked and now everybody has forgotten about it. But even this was this idea that NATO could play a part in the Gulf. But of course, I mean, what can NATO do that the Americans cannot do? Usually cheaper and better. I mean, not much. And both the French and the British, they try to have certainly an influence there, but they're not. They don't want to multilateralize that presence. So, like, forget about NATO in the Gulf. This is how sort of oftentimes instead the smaller sheikdoms feel, with the Iran-American rivalry. like being, and this is all being confirmed. This actually was from before the nuclear deal. So you see you have US and Iran, you know, like saber rattling above the water, like the poor Arab states of the Gulf being caught in between these disputes, but at the same time they're shaking hands like under the water. And all of this like came true as they struck a deal, which we're going to talk about in a second, over the Iran nuclear program. So it's tough to be sort of small players in this geopolitical game. All right, this is kind of like what Saudi is trying to do, is trying to sort of like utilize things like the Arab League and to address the Syrian issue with the UN. This is also very new. But just, you know, as a final thought, cooperative transfer of political responsibility does not lessen the military dependence on the US. That's not going to happen. So in conclusion, so what is going on? You have these domestic sectarian divides that are being exploited by Iran and Saudi Arabia, and this further worsens the humanitarian and educational catastrophes. I mean, we have had like President Karzai speaking before, so we do know what starts happening when you have generation of school children not going to school. You are like, you know, sort of like planting the seeds of future conflict, and this is what is going on right now in Syria and in large parts of Iraq and Yemen. There is going to be a very long war by proxy and a further securitization of the region. So you're going to have these more arms sales, sub-state violence, and civil conflicts. So final slide, where do we go from here? I mean, basically we are going to hell in many places there, but hopefully back, because we do have a fair signs that like the big powers are starting to intervene to try to find a political solution. So there are talks about, you know, like unofficial contact in Oman between the Russians, the Americans, to try to sort of like bring a political solution. One thing that could happen, I mean, I didn't talk much about this, but I'm happy to do it in the Q&A, is that the recent agreement with Iran may open a few political spaces. If anything else, it removes the hypocrisy that because of that, you cannot talk to Iran about anything else. But if we go instead beyond, maybe some political, some files like the Syrian one can be opened by the Americans and the Iranians talking about that, even if this is going to be strenuously resisted by two steadfast American allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia. So in sum, what I hope is going to happen is that there is going to be a climate where both Saudi Arabia and Iran have less of an incentive to continue to meddle in the weaker states of the region. This is the most we can hope for, because so far, both in terms of Iran and Saudi Arabia, they see this as a zero-sum game, and they continue to meddle in the smaller states of the region, bringing instability, bringing further destabilization, and overall quite a bit of human suffering. Thank you very much indeed.